Good evening, good evening. How's everybody doing tonight?
Good.
Good. Good. If you're having a conversation, sit down.
Some changes or whatever.
I have to wrangle the meeting speaker. Okay. Welcome to MySec Southfield. My name is Brett Hansen. I am the Southfield coordinator. We have multiple MySecs that meet up all over the state of Michigan. We have MySec Jackson that meets the second Tuesday of the month, MySec Lansing that meets the second Wednesday of the month, and then MySec Southfield, which meets the second Thursday of the month. And there's also MySec Grand Rapids now, I do believe. Does anybody know if there's a meeting schedule?
Not scheduled, but they're doing socials to set up. They're still looking for a place to meet. I believe they're doing one tonight, but just join Slack for more information.
Okay. So again, for those who may not hear that on the stream, MySec Grand Rapids is getting off the ground. They're doing a lot of socials. Get onto MySec, the Slack group, and then look for the Grand Rapids channel, join it, and then you'll get all the details there. We also are affiliated with IC Squared, which meets the fourth Tuesday of the month, North Oakland ISSA, Motor City ISSA, and Lansing ISSA. If anybody's interested in attending any of those meetings I just mentioned, I have the information here. Come ping me, I'll forward it to you. That way you can be involved in the security community all over Michigan. We're currently meeting at Town Square Food and Spirits. Please pass your thanks to the staff that have provided this great room and service. There will be snacks coming in, I think some flatbread pizzas. Please help yourself to the food during the meeting. I don't want any of it to go to waste, so please eat it or take it home. And also thank you to Tech Systems for providing the food and the snacks here in this room. Be part of MySec. If you have a topic for a talk, let me know what you would like to see. We're always open to new ideas. Maybe there's something we haven't thought of yet. And if you would like to give a talk, please see me. I'm still looking for someone for next month. So if you have a talk prepared, need somebody to work with on it, I will be more than willing to help you. Announcements. MySec Social is going to be Thursday, October 25th. We're still determining the location. So look on to mysec.us on the calendar, and you'll be able to see once we get it posted where it's going to be. But we are going somewhere. It's usually a great time. The last few times we've gone out, I think we've had almost 15 people there. Circle City Con has a Derby discount. Tickets are only $85. I purchased my ticket today. If you haven't purchased your ticket, do so. It's a really good conference. They really focus on training. With the last year I went there, they had elk training, they have malware analysis training, and the training. What conference is this? The Circle City Con, which is in Indianapolis. Okay. So not too far away, about four and a half hours. And like I was mentioning, they're really focused on training, and the training usually only costs $5. So the elk training and the malware analysis training I received was at least valued probably a couple grand each. So it's really, really cool. And of course they have fantastic talks. Converge Detroit is only 216 days away. It is right around the corner. It is May 16th and 17th. I did not see an RFP posted yet, but keep an eye on Converge, what's the website? Converge Conference, thank you. Converge Conference, and you can find out when they actually start accepting papers. If you're looking to give a talk there at Converge, by all means, let me know because you want to practice first, right? So we'll have you here. Early bird tickets for Converge are on sale. They're only $100. So you can buy them already. RUCTFE is being led up by James Green, is taking place November 10th, and I'll let you have the floor if there's any more information.
Yeah, so the RCTF, November 10th, it'll start at 5 a.m. We're looking at a place in Wixom. If you guys are interested in joining us and you haven't done it yet, join us on Slack. There's an RUCTFE channel. Join there, and then we have an Eventbrite page to get a ticket just so we know how many people are coming.
So those who aren't familiar with RUCTFE, come by, talk to me, talk to James. It's a real good time. It's a multinational competition. We've scored well some years, not so well other years, but if anything, you can definitely learn something.
And it's probably also worth mentioning, like, you don't have to have done a CTF before. It's open to all skill levels. So even if you've never done one, and you just think it would be fun, you should still come out.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to do communication the whole time. So, like,
he's a manager. Thank you.
Stand on the table and yell at people? I won't yell. No, that's not a good culture.
That's senior management.
He whispers aggressive.
I will.
All right. Are there any job postings that anybody's looking to share? Yes, sir.
Ally Financial has a security architect and 4 or 5 BRSO business risk security officer roles, which is the director level role in one security organization.
Okay. Anybody else? Hiring?
eCentire will be hiring professional services and advisory services folks starting around the end of the year, leading into next year. And we're also going to be launching our eCentire Academy. So there will be opportunities for remote workers for certain positions, so just keep an eye on the job site.
Okay. Anybody seeking jobs? So those people who just meet up. Also, tech systems. Tech systems help me out with my current job. They help facilitate the food for the meeting. By all means, I can put you in contact with somebody. Andrew Witt was out there, so just let them know, and they can definitely help you out. Any other announcements? No announcements. Fantastic. Any other special events anybody would like to share? All right, fantastic. So without further ado, we have a security strategy with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework by Stephen Legg, also known as Zenmo.
So I know I look a little different than last time, only a little bit, but
Oh, sorry, technical difficulties.
it's all
You're
right.
okay.
You good?
Yep.
So, before we get started, I want you guys to know that this talk is still kind of draft. There's certain parts of it that I want to flesh out more, specifically some of the additional guidance and details around details around monitors. The long and short of it is I'm going to be putting out some content that's essentially a lightweight framework for people with no governance, risk, or compliance background that need to implement IT policies, security strategy, and other kind of higher level strategic initiatives within their organizations and to help them gain buy-in and a foothold around those tasks and objectives. So some of that is missing. I will speak to a lot of the resources, and if you have questions or if there's certain things that you're looking for assistance, I'm going to hit multiple risks or multiple objectives in many veins of action. So I don't know why I left the word promise at the top, but anyway, so the goal, the outcome or overall objective of the talk, high level, is to really simplify security strategy, give you guys some kind of meat to chew on in terms of ways you might approach it within your organizations, and also to help you understand the NIST CSF and break it down into a little bit simpler form. Because the way it's written, I don't know if any of you have looked at some of the documentation, for folks that aren't familiar with that style of material, it can be very daunting. So, as I mentioned, the objectives are to give you guys takeaways, give you something that you can go and apply within your own security programs, pair that with resources that you can use to make those tangible improvements, and then also avoid putting you to sleep. So, for a little bit about me, I'm a principal security strategist at eCentire. Essentially what that means is that for a lot of businesses that are my clients, I act as their CISO. That gets me involved in everything from budget discussions to control architecture to lifecycle planning and many other topics. I've held a number of different titles in the past, and my entire career has been in technology since I've been a professional in IT, information security, and governance, risk, and compliance. So these are my daughters. The left one is Avery, and the right one is Abby, and she's now 5 months old, and that's why I came out of my cave. And this is an awesome piece of art with my wife, who's sitting here, Nicole, in it. Somebody who is not a manager, who is a security engineer of some kind. I want to hear what your thoughts on what security strategy means. Anybody? Anybody want to be a guinea pig?
Spin the bottle.
Spin the bottle? Okay.
So wherever it lands is the direction we're going.
All right. So that's how most organizations address security strategy, or strategery in that case. But really, that presents a large challenge, right? Like, how do you decide what you're doing first? Where do you even begin to understand what your priorities are? And one way that you do that, and it can be very challenging, as Drake is experiencing here, cybersecurity frameworks or different control frameworks, governance frameworks, and risk frameworks. There's lots of them out there. These are just three that are pretty common and big in the industry. those frameworks themselves can present their own inherent challenges. As I mentioned, NIST, the way it's written, or much of the NIST ecosystem, the way it's written, it's all like a Cisco white paper. It's just very, very dry. It's very academically sound, and it really represents a very good understanding of each one of those topics. But it's hard to take that and translate it into an end result that makes an impact for you and your organization. So your boss, manager, director, or your executive is just sitting there looking at his phone going, how do we address security? And you're saying, well, we need to buy this and that and this. And he's going, just fix my damn BlackBerry. All right. Let's keep this moving. That lack of direction and lack of ability to communicate things up the stack to get executive alignment, that's one of the biggest pain points I hear from my clients, and one of the ways that I help them out a lot. Because by the very nature of using a framework, using risk-based modeling and some other things that we'll talk about as we talk about the framework, those contexts give you a powerful message to people that really don't understand security, but will understand business risk. So to summarize, or to just kind of go back over what the challenges are, we have a challenge in understanding what our direction is, because we have to make decisions day to day. We have a challenge in applying frameworks or best practices or bodies of knowledge that are out there. And then we have a challenge in getting that buy-in to make those things effective and get budgets, approvals, political alignment, all the things that are required to make something happen with an organization from a security perspective occur. And so overall, we want our risk to go down, and we want our strategy to be sound. And so how do we do that? Where do we begin? How do we scope that effort? And so one thing that I like to, beyond the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, one thing that I like to talk about a lot with my clients is you need to break up things into reasonable chunks, into actionable sets of tasks that can actually be achieved in the period of time you're setting out. A lot of people, or a lot of security consultants make the mistake of coming into organizations and going, red flags everywhere, you're missing all this stuff, you got to do everything right now. And every organization is going to look at them and go, thanks for throwing a report over the wall. Now we have to actually go figure out how to do this. So if you want to do that, you want to make things aligned with best practices, but do it in a lightweight way. The NIST CSF really is kind of a step in that direction in and of itself. It's way lighter weight, way more strategic in nature, but even it itself suffers from some of the setbacks of NIST. So in terms of taking NIST and turning it into something that can be executive aligned and something that is considered by your organization as a core part of your security strategy, you really have to do a couple of things. You have to get an understanding of what your risks are, and that can come from many different places, whether it's just you doing an internal assessment and putting yourself through kind of a business impact analysis and some other risk management methodologies, or you can hire a third-party consultant. You can base it off of penetration test results, as good or bad as that might be. But whatever your source is, you have to in some way start to quantify and understand your risk. And so before you get too far, you need to also set the right expectations with your management. I would always encourage you to say that there will be asks, say there will be a need for spending, but don't go to the hills crying wolf when you aren't really 100% sure what you even need yet. Get all your planning completed and figure out your approach before you go and raise the alarm bells. So for those of you that haven't seen the NIST CSF, this is a tragically small but also complete look at all the areas and subcategories within it. Now I'm not going to go in detail through all of these, but if you just do a Google search for the NIST CSF and look for version 1.1, that's the newest version. If you want to get a deeper understanding of these, the great thing about them is that if you look at these, the labels, all of these labels, the detail in each section is mapped not only to NIST control frameworks that exist and other NIST documents in that ecosystem, but from there translated into other standards like ISO and other, like the critical security controls, other things like that.
Two questions that are
Sure.
related. One is this framework linear, meaning you would progress from, say, blue to green? And if so, where would you say most companies are on that? And if not, what's a kind of strategy to do it in tandem? Because you said, don't tell us all the red flags, you're just going to report them.
Right, yeah. So companies that, it really depends on what industry they're in and what the history of the organization is. But in general, where I see companies have maturity with that before they've really made a concentrated security effort are in things like identity management and access control. Occasionally they have awareness training already in place. They have some protective technologies. They have typically some kind of security monitoring, but it's usually not complete. And so their detection processes are usually kind of nascent. And occasionally they'll have some response planning. For the most part, one, to answer your first question, and I apologize I did not repeat it. Your first question was, is it linear? Is the NIST CSF linear? It's not, but the way you should understand it or contextualize it is that everything above will inform or support everything below. So all the governance, policy, everything from like an IT risk management standpoint happens up here in Identify. That's where you're kind of laying that groundwork. And really, the approach that I like for folks that are starting with a clean slate is don't draft and then immediately implement the policies, but draft the policies, and while you draft them and decide on what's going to go in them or make up the guidelines that you're going to set forth for security within your organization, use that as a process or as a call to action to have those conversations with executives, with the other stakeholders that are going to have to support this initiative overall. Put it in that context because that gives you a business context to talk with them about it. Okay, we have an IT risk management program. We need to address these things within that. What do you guys think we should do? Yes?
So when you establish these policies, you also establish a time frame of when you should be evaluating. Most companies I've seen reevaluate their policies every year.
Okay.
If it's compliance purposes, once a quarter. Have you actually seen a shift to review these policies more often at all, or is it generally still within your time frame?
Depends on the type and purpose of the review. For internal compliance purposes, that life cycle and the cadence of those reviews will be tied to whatever the pressures are. So like in pretty heavily regulated industries, energy, banking, a lot of those requirements require attestations at different points throughout the year. For folks that don't have specific timeframes tied to them, it's usually an annual review, and sometimes there's a separate third-party review that they do. That's been my experience. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Are there ways to force a review? So there's obviously if it's based on compliance or regulatory, but if you're stepping into an organization and as pointed out, they haven't done a review and you're trying to implement new ones, is that something you can require or ask them?
Me personally as a consultant, or?
As a consultant to the organization.
So as a consultant to the organization, usually when I'm coming into engagements, I'm doing so with the tip of the spear being a maturity assessment. So that's a good context to kind of pull all that together and say, hey, what are you doing today? What does it look like? How are we measuring it? Where is it going? What's your plan? That's usually the context of a review that I do as a consultant or a third party. If you're a person internally in the company, a good way to do that is to introduce either a framework, introduce like an IT risk discussion if that hasn't been had within the organization before, and if it has, go look like at meeting minutes and some of the backlog, whatever is available to you. Get a sense for kind of where the heads of the folks on that risk committee are, and then approach it in a context that they're going to understand. So did that answer your question?
It did.
Did I get all of your questions? Okay. So yeah, so these are the areas. Again, this is the NIST CSF, and we're going to use this to kind of talk about all of these kind of practical outcomes that, from my perspective, are really foundational in nature before you can implement this widely.
You mentioned maturity. Does the framework allow for like phases of maturity, or is it pretty much prescriptive for everything?
It does, and actually what's interesting about the NIST CSF is beyond, so there's really two stages from my perspective of folks that are implementing it. And I apologize, I haven't been repeating the question, so let me do that with him. So your question was, does the framework give a context to reflect maturity? And if so, what does that look like, right? Is that accurate?
Yes.
So it does. The way that NIST in this way represents it, I like better than how it's traditionally been done in the consulting world, which is either aligning with some kind of known standard like the CMMI or some other way of measuring capability maturity model. For those of you that don't know, I apologize. I use too many acronyms in my day-to-day. Getting away from that and using it more based on capability levels that you establish when you're adopting the framework. So like if you look at the NIST CSF document, they actually have a tiering structure with examples for many areas, but they allow you to define your own. So from an IT risk perspective, for a small community bank, those maturity levels look a lot different than, say, a government organization that works at the Department of Defense.
Do they have like predefined templates of what should be a financial institution's maturity in each of the area versus a software development?
They do, but not all of them are directly in the CSF. Some of them are in other NIST frameworks. Like their supply chain risk framework has a number of them that are aligned with different types of verticals or industries that you would work with and manage supply chain risk. But there's many like that that exist within the ecosystem. If you go to the NIST website, there's actually a directory of all the NIST documentation, and you can search that pretty well if you know some Google foo. So did that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, cool. All right, so in terms of understanding identify, the identify area, this is the description that NIST gives of this. So anybody that's had a minute to read this, do you want to kind of query your thoughts on what this means to you and what you would take away from this? Anyone, any volunteers? You don't have to have any experience with it. There's no judgments here, for me, anyway.
I mean, step one would be trying to at least try to identify everything on your network. It seems that a lot of times there's endpoints that are unknown.
That is one good point, yes, absolutely. Anything else? It's not super clear, right? They mentioned, they use some keywords in here that if you were an insider you might grab onto and know, but it's not real prescriptive. So simplifying that down in terms of actionable steps you could take to establish a foothold in this area of the NIST CSF. Getting an asset inventory, to your point about knowing where everything is. That could be as simple as some tailored Nmap scanning. Could be as simple as using an RMM tool or other non-security tools to gather that information. Performing a network map or diagramming, and then including in that, this is a piece that's always missing, from my experience, is the data flow layer. Understanding what data is moving where, what services are talking to where data is actually being transacted between these systems. That understanding, from my perspective, especially when implementing or considering security controls, is absolutely key to making them successful, and not just checking a box or putting something in place that's not really going to actually stop the risk in that area. Security roles and responsibilities. This seems pretty high level, or like it would be an assumed reality, but you'd be shocked at how many organizations have even security folks that they hire. They don't even have very well-defined roles and responsibilities for them, let alone the rest of the organization, who is also responsible for security.
You said that the security roles and responsibilities seems to be kind of void across the board. Do a lot of those organizations that have that issue, do they also have lagging business continuity plans or disaster recovery policies? Do you see them having weaknesses with those policies too?
So his question was, for anyone that couldn't hear it, do companies only struggle? Do they only struggle with the roles and responsibilities piece from a definition standpoint, or are there also other common kind of deficiencies from a documentation perspective? Is that accurate?
Yeah, because I would say those policies generally define those roles and responsibilities.
Yes. Yeah. It's they're both part and parcel of one another, right? So if you don't have well-defined roles and responsibilities, you probably don't have well-defined policies and vice versa. Or if your policies are defined, maybe they're not aligned with reality and they don't have anything to do with what your security life cycles really look like within the organization. And that really leads us into the next item, that the policies, establishing a policy set is really important, but most people don't even know where to start or what should be included in a policy. Like, does anybody know off the top of their head what should be in an information security policy?
Acceptable use.
That is a good one. Anybody else?
Business continuity, disaster recovery.
That's another good one. Yes, absolutely. Anybody else?
Backup.
That's another good one. Yeah.
Identity and access control. Is it?
That's another good one. Yeah.
Is incident response also part of that?
That absolutely is. Yes. And there's a difference between an incident response policy and an incident response plan. They're very different purposes. But yeah, all of those things are great answers. But the reality is, if you were to verbosely map out everything that could be governed by a policy, there'd probably be over like 50 or 60 policies at least within an organization. And that's if you did them all as separate policies and didn't have a centralized information security policy. Corresponding with, but also separate from policies, is an IT risk management program. From my perspective, this is the big one that's missing most places, that is really stifling security and IT leadership from being able to move the ball with the executives that are non-technical insiders. That's the one that gives you the powerful business context and conversation that you can have with other people, because then you're not talking about, we need a SIM, or we need endpoint protection, or I need a file integrity monitoring solution, or I need this or that, or more FTEs. You're talking, we have these business risks, we have no mitigation strategy for them. These are the potential outcomes and impacts of those risks if there was a situation manifested that affected the systems involved in these things. What are we going to do, guys? We have to make a serious business decision about this. That's a whole different conversation than I need money, or I want to SIM. And then vulnerability management. Vulnerability management, and this is separate from the tool and all the operational life cycle end of it. A vulnerability management program is really dictating how you take information from penetration tests, from risk assessments, from vulnerability scans, and translate that into priorities for remediation within your technical environment. So at a basic level, having your asset list, understanding based on what the criticality of those assets, what kind of weight each one holds, and then using some logic to take the results of those different forms of testing and then kind of add up the math between them to figure out which ones are actually the highest priority. That all of those things are really kind of foundational areas that, from an identified perspective, need to be addressed in the NIST CSF. And there's more than this. Like if you go and read the framework, there's more than this, but these are ones I would consider a good starting point for most organizations. Any questions on this before I move on?
Do they consider the risk management program a function of security, or is that an independent risk organization outside of security?
They don't define that super well, or they don't define that ownership super well. They basically say, this is IT risk and this is the discipline, and it should be owned by somebody that is proficient with this and will follow this methodology. They don't really they don't prescribe certain things like that. My recommendation is that it should be, if you have a risk office, it should be owned by them, but it should be supported with engineering and other security people as a part of whatever group is doing the managing. Because without that context, it's always going to kind of fall on its face.
Yeah, I imagine the market vertical would dictate that. Like banking regulation says you have to have independent risk versus because it can't be, it's a conflict of interest if it's in the same org as security.
Yep, it all depends. That is a good point.
So, one more thing.
Sure.
One thing that seems to be missing is data governance and data classification. So if a server is holding PII versus a kiosk that's displaying information, they're held differently in terms of the risk.
It's in the framework. I didn't include it in this list because usually that's too lofty a goal for like year one.
It's a subcomponent asset, right?
It is, yeah. Or it describes assets, yeah. But yeah, that is, in the framework, it's called out in its own separate sub-item. I just didn't include it here because, again, I think, like if we were to say, look at the first 12 months of a brand new security program, establishing a data classification scheme that was meaningful would not go over very well. Because at that point, they're still understanding like what security is for them, what their risks are. They're not there yet, typically.
Quick follow-up on that. So if you're saying that within the first 12 months, it's okay to maybe kind of set that aside, that data classification, what would you say is the timeline by which you need to start addressing that?
I would say beyond these foundational elements, most things need to be addressed by 18 months. If you're starting off completely fresh and brand new, unless you truly have no resources and there is a literal choke point in your ability to execute on these things, or other circumstances that are very prohibitive, there's really not an excuse not to get it done in that time frame. Most teams, even small teams, can do that. So, any other questions before I move on? Great. So the protect area, again, this is really talking about all of the proactive protection measures, controls, procedures that can be put in place, and also awareness training and data security or to reinforce what you were saying about data classification. The extremities and execution of all of that is in this area. So talking about what I would like to see, like that, again, that first 12 months, would love if you can understand your roles, and this is kind of a precursor to doing a successful data classification scheme in my eyes, getting role-based access control in place, an actual well thought out provisioned role-based access control system, your physical access control if that's a concern for you, based on the types of physical security measures that you need to have in place, network security, remote security versus local, kind of all the different contexts that people work within your organization. All of that needs to be understood and addressed in this area.
In your experience, out of those access controls, which one do you see that is the weakest, or like the one that companies tend to have the worst access control on?
Typically, it's at the network layer. So his question was, where do people fall down the most commonly on access controls? Typically, the network layer is where they do it because they don't have either the technical understanding to subdivide or segment the network, or they just don't have the technology to do it because those tend to be the more expensive pieces.
So, before we dive deeper, there's a point where I personally think that a lot of companies fail at is, okay, great, we start a strategy. We identified all our assets. Where does threat mapping fall? So you can successfully develop the right disaster recovery in the DCP. And at what stage, I should say, what stage of this process should you focus more on threat mapping instead of, okay, just put DLP on every single device here and go run home?
So I think it depends on the maturity of the organization and the type of leadership. If you get through establishing kind of a basic risk management framework and you're comfortable with that, to where you can start introducing like different types of threats or additional kind of ways of evaluating threats, that's when I would look at those kind of changes. Or
after you build your basics out.
Yeah, exactly. That would be like a 8-month to 12-month.
Okay, that's what I was looking for.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So his question, sorry, was at what point do you go from just understanding basic risk to accounting for specific external threats that are contextually relevant to your organization or the organization that you're working with? Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. So I talked about the access control. Security awareness, I think, is a key one that should start almost day one. There's so many off-the-shelf solutions out there that do this well. There's really no excuse not to have it. Asset inventory reviews, again, this is not linear, but these do kind of build on each other. So once you have an asset inventory, have a process for reviewing or identifying changes that have occurred within the asset inventory within a time frame. You know, if it's really arduous for you to get that information, maybe do it every month. Ideally, you're doing it weekly or at some shorter interval to catch any kind of malicious changes that occur from a configuration management perspective. And I also talk about that a little bit down below. So authorization and access reviews, doing a look at what permissions, what rights people have, and validating that there's a business reason for those rights to exist. That's a big one, I think, for a lot of companies that they fall down on because nobody really wants to go and inventory everything to go figure that out. Change in configuration management, these kind of go hand in hand, but they are separate. Change management really is a good way to manage any kind of creep of credentialing or privileged access over the long term, as well as any kind of technical debt or shadow IT that might go on depending on what's happening in the organization. And configuration management is that kind of single point of truth, keeping your systems honest and accountable to the security standards that you set forward, and there's a number of ways to enforce that. Data loss prevention and file integrity monitoring both bear mentioning here, although those are not things typically that I see people tackle in year one. I just wanted to include them because they are critical security technologies. Backups are another big one, annual testing, and having disaster recovery, business continuity, and incident response plans is also a really important piece of this, as well as vulnerability scanning. Again, this is all kind of the proactive effort that comes from the planning that we've established and identified. So any questions here? Okay. I know this is kind of dry, guys, I apologize. Like I said, this was pretty draft. So detect. Detect is really all about being aware of security events that are happening within the organization so that you can identify if there is an incident occurring and respond to it. The response part comes in the next section. So as this mentions, it's all kind of focused around how you classify anomalies and events, what thresholds you set for establishing those alerts and notifications. The fact that you have continuous monitoring in place in many different areas of your organization, and then what the detection processes actually look like at a more nuts and bolts level. So simplified, this is how and when and where you're reviewing logs and alerts, and who's doing it. Investigation and documentation of security events that come out of that review, and then technologies like your IDS IPS, your SIM, web application firewalls, and other technologies that can detect or alert you to different types of security events happening within the organization. Any questions here?
Does NIST provide any standards around how to set up the different alerts, or is it just like, yeah, you should be watching these things?
In my opinion, NIST doesn't do a great job of it. There's some detail in that in like the 853 framework. I just find that a lot of folks that I direct to that come up with a lot more questions than answers. I think like the critical security controls, and I don't know if you've ever seen the CIS benchmarks. The CIS benchmarks are a great source of truth for logging and alerting, for security settings, and how those kind of technologies should be configured.
Yeah, picking off of what Brian's saying, usually what I find a lot of this stuff comes down to, there's some basic level stuff like logons and what everyone is checking, but a lot of it comes down to is what's your threat model and what are your keys to the kingdom, what are you protecting? A WAF is not important if you don't really have anything web focused. But it's huge if you're a web services. If you're providing pretty much nothing but web services, that's huge. It's a big deal. Probably less concerned about your IDS and IPS stuff.
There's other resources as well, such as SANS, that have some really good white papers that people written, and Micro Framework is really good for your SIM and even for your WAF.
Plus, tuning is going to be very specific to your app, right? So you could dump everything to a SIM, but unless the SIM understands what's important to you or what is a security event in your application, it's not going to matter, right?
Yeah, and even with a well-funded, well-staffed team, I think tuning a SIM or any technology like these is like a 3 to 6 month process. It's not going to happen overnight, even if you put a lot of attention and effort into it. That's one of the faux pas I think that as an industry we need to get over. Like, yes, everything is a huge risk, and there's a tremendous risk in not having any technology like these, but we also have to understand that the business can only react so fast, so we have to really focus on that prioritization piece and know that we're putting our best foot forward at each stage to manage the biggest risks early on and kind of trickle it down from there. So any other questions on this section?
So you would, to sum it up, you would say that detecting based upon what is like business critical is probably best. Like what they were saying about, you don't have a lot of stuff, web focus, the WAF is pointless. And so you were saying if a SIM is not configured to what's critical, then it's not doing its purpose.
Yes. So to answer the question, can I have you repeat it one more time? I don't want to get it wrong.
I just forgot it. I didn't come on the spot. I was like, wait, what's going on? So to sum it up, what you're saying is the detecting phase, you really have to identify like what is business critical, because if you don't have you detecting around things that are not like a business continuity plan, stuff like that, like around what's critical, you really have to focus on.
Yeah, and so to repeat the question, so he was asking about prioritizing defense measures based on where areas of criticality within the business are. I think that starts at the asset level and understanding what the asset, like the weighting of those assets initially, and then that would be further enhanced by data classification and kind of data mapping, understanding that better. But I think that I really believe for most organizations it's a two-step process.
Even beyond that, my regulators now are hammering us to not only have all these things and say that we have rules for them, but now we also have to establish a risk threshold or tolerance or risk appetite. So it's a risk-based approach to it. So then you have to tailor those to every time you do a pen test or whatever. What are the current threat actors? Is it a nation state threat actor? Is phishing the biggest thing? Is it vishing? Is it because somebody had tailgated your building? Can they drop a device on the network and you don't have NAC running everywhere? They want you to actually define the risk that your company, your industry is facing, and tune it to that even one step further.
So you essentially need like perfect visibility of your.
It's not perfect visibility, it's just understanding what you're willing to tolerate and what are the biggest threats to you, and focus on those bigger risks rather than don't sweat the small stuff.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like you have to have like quite the visibility of your scope so that you know like what's at risk.
So when you're reading this and listening to him, you have to understand that this framework is set up like an onion. Your step 1 isn't going to feature step 2, it's going to feature step 3. Set up your IOCs and your SIM. Well, that's because you've already set up the foundations, and it's all derived from the risk. So when you initially set up your environment, you start up the strategy, you start collecting logs on everything, you start fine-tuning it, and as the maturity model, like you said, at 8 months you start doing the threat mapping. Then you're going to start fine-tuning the SIM. Okay, I don't need to know every time this guy goes to Indeed.com. Let's turn off that.
You might want to keep track of that.
That's user behavior analytics. Then you watch for data leakage.
So essentially, when you're viewing it, think of it as a layered approach. Even though it's one framework, it's really meant to be layered on top of each other. And as the strategy continues to build, it's going to feed into different little rabbit holes, I call them, because then you get really messy.
Well, and going back to your comment about risk and kind of how those things layer together, that's really one of the reasons that risk is such a critical early stage objective. Because again, if you lack that context to talk about it, you are not going to get alignment on any of the stuff that comes after it. Even though there's many different ways to skin the cat, like you could do risk first, but then implement different controls in different orders depending on what you have alignment around or what maybe technology you already have in place. That's not super important, but it is very important to establish those foundations first so that you can build on them to get there, no matter what path's brought you to it. So, any other questions on this section? All right. So respond. Just in the word, it kind of very succinctly sums up exactly what this is all about. So it goes from response planning to how communication during security incidents occurs, to how you're analyzing and what procedures you're using to kind of categorize the threat that's presented by whatever that event is, all the way through mitigating and identifying kind of improvements that will mitigate or that will continue or give you the ability to continually improve your detection mechanisms and response mechanisms. And so really that's, at a basic level, at a minimum, an annual review of all security events that have occurred, like in the last year, doing an analysis post-mortem, looking at the lessons learned that happened then, looking at it again and making sure that nothing was missed, validating that the documentation and everything that happened when those events occurred or those incidents occurred did adhere to your incident response plan, and if they didn't, where did they go off the path? How can we get better? Do we need to adjust the plan, or are there things we need to change about it? Validating your detection and response actions, so looking at, and this could be done in a spot check format, this could be done in mass, like every quarter, but looking at the write-ups that have happened on events that have been detected getting an understanding kind of what your analysts are doing or what your SOC is doing and where their heads are at and what they're actually mitigating with their actions. And then also communication plan usage, or validating the communication plan was followed post-incident in all of these different contexts where it applies. So disaster recovery, business continuity, and incident response plan. Brad?
No, borrow a bit of the manufacturing thing, you can go a little further than this. If anyone's ever heard of manufacturing of Six Sigma, you start going into are we improving upon this? You know, not just, hey, are we meeting our goals, but are we exceeding them? Are we doing better, or are we going negative? And you start to try and evaluate that with some of the previous steps you've done, into saying, hey, where are we going wrong? Are we improving? And such. Basically start to get those metrics and really kind of dig into them, not just, hey, we're meeting the goal, but you can start to go to your superiors and say, hey, we're exceeding it. It's working. We're getting better. Or something's going terribly wrong. We don't know where it is. We need more staff here trying to analyze this.
Yeah, and so kind of consistent with, I agree with you, consistent with that, that also kind of ports into the recover area, which is largely understanding certain aspects of like business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response as it pertains to building better resilience that's measurable, and then making sure that any kind of capabilities or availability that's lost through the course of an incident gets restored in accordance with the plans that have been set forward. This also includes really kind of some descriptions of ways to analyze post-mortem a lot of that activity and how the recovery actions can be improved. Again, Brad, to your point, making sure that continual improvement is happening, that you're not backsliding or not your processes and procedures are not getting worse, and that the outcomes of those are not getting worse. So at a basic level, again, it's similar to respond, but a little bit different. So this would be like after the fact, looking at the review procedures that are actually defined in your incident response plan and in that program, and making sure that those are giving you a continuous improvement, and if not, tweaking and changing them. Insofar as to accomplish that, identifying actually your internal process for taking those lessons learned, either representing them in your understanding of IT risk, as a threat vector, whatever place that information should show up, and then translating that into some kind of remediation that can be executed. Validating or doing both of those things to continue validating that your IRP and other similar programs are improving. Things like public relations and third-party communication. This could be outbound communication to clients or stakeholders that have a vested interest in the security of your company. This could be third-party regulators that you have to report to or attest to when events occur, like for folks that are beholden to GDPR. Reporting those incidents to the appropriate office is a really important and very tightly managed part of that. But also basically taking the results of all the work that's being done to get to this point and then having that presentable and translatable to get both executive visibility and executive buy-in to the continual improvement and management of and oversight of these things. So any questions there?
I wouldn't say any questions. I do have a comment though on the third-party communication. Seeing a lot of the new regulations, state-level regulations come out, NYDFS, CCPA, Rhode Island has one, but that mandatory reporting time frame, NYDFS, for example, 72 hours, being part of, I think, what is being communicated in the recover portion here of NIST CSF.
Yep.
I hope that a federal regulation comes out, because if we have 52 individual state regulations, it's going to be really difficult. But right now we have a couple of states that are taking on cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's a great addition, and that is true. Both from a security and a privacy perspective, a lot of states are adopting their own laws that affect a lot of these things. And so this is where a lot of that would show up. It wasn't a question, but more of a comment, talking about kind of the state of law across the nation in our more local state bodies. Any other questions or comments, thoughts? So really, I know this was kind of a crash course. I hope now you guys all have your helmets on and are ready, absolutely, to just rush into the world of IT governance. I know that that's not the case. But when you are ready and you do go through this process, let's say you do a self-assessment and you start to kind of formulate this plan and try to gain alignment and create alignment around security and the governance of your security relative to the business. When do you present that? I think getting early alignment on the concept is important, but I would, for anyone that's an internal practitioner applying these concepts or these frameworks, make sure that you have your ducks in a row from both a risk and a framework perspective before you go have those conversations, because otherwise the questions that will come up along the way will push you in that direction, and if you don't have those answers, it'll hurt the overall effort and credibility of the project and initiative in the company. So that's my kind of 2 cents on, when you're ready to go do that. Really focus on kind of getting the planning together, have your initial look at risk, have some of these foundational areas covered, or at least your plan for covering them, and then have these conversations. So I guess until next time, keep it classy. That's all I got.
So before you end, I wanted to save this and not interrupt kind of the tail end of the conversation. Will you go back to slide 2 of your respond category?
Sure.
So you mentioned here three of the 4 bullet points are all about validating, right? So validating adherence to the IRP makes sense, right? Did it adhere to what we were actually saying? Validating detection and response, did it do what we thought it was going to do? That's fine. What would you say validating the communication plan looks like? Like, how do you actually validate that happened?
So that comes down to, again, building on the risk conversation and asset understanding. When you establish like an RTO, RPO, or an SLA for the assets that you have, and those assets are reflected in the documentation of that incident that occurred, understanding, okay, did we get to this in the time frame we sought to get it to it in? If that didn't happen, why? And usually, not always, but usually it's communication or documentation related in terms of moving information from one practitioner to another or one group to another that's involved in the incident. That's been my experience.
And I would add to that too, so validating the communication plan for VR, BCP, IRP is a tabletop exercise. So you say that an incident occurs and you get everybody on the same tabletop and you say, all right, I just called Bob, and then Bob called Joe, and then Joe called this person. And so just walking through your communication plan on a tabletop is really a good way of doing that.
Yeah. I didn't mention that, but you're absolutely right, and you should actually do tabletops for all 3 of those plans every year. That was a great add. I'm going to add that to my slides. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Failover testing could be part of an example of validating.
Yeah. Well, that I would include that probably in like a disaster recovery business continuity test, like whether it's going dark and failing over or however you approximate it. But that is another good test. Yes, absolutely. Anything else? All right, great. Thanks for having me, guys.